Real stories of werewolves, of Dogman from history, from your emails, illustrated and animated with the democratizing magic of machine learning AI. Welcome to Scary Stories. It's a bigger thriller than Manila. It's the knockdown, drag-out episode you've been salivating for. Buckle your safety belts and hang onto your hats because it's time for Dogman versus Bigfoot. Who is the greatest monster of them all? Ready? Let us begin.
The Dogman versus Googway battle in northern Michigan. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a Dogman story for you in which he and a big long-faced Sasquatch-type creature nearly knocked me and my girlfriend off a cliff. This was the craziest thing that ever happened to me, and weirdly enough, it became a life-changing moment. Sometimes just surviving something that you thought would finish you off can be enough to give you a brand new view of what life is truly all about. My girlfriend Sue in this story is now my wife, and she was the one who actually told me that I should write to you. It was only a few months ago that she read about the Googway online, and she has convinced me that that was what we saw battling the Dogman. She also, about 4 years ago, had discovered the Dogman online. She knows I still obsess over that encounter that day when we both nearly plunged to our doom, and she's been helping me in all the years since the incident to make sense of what actually happened. I'm sure she's working through it herself, but Sue is one of those wives that actually doesn't hate her husband. None of my friends believe me when I tell them that, and they all think she's just trained me to say nice things about her. I don't know anybody my age with a happy marriage, unfortunately, so you're more likely to believe me about the two monsters battling than about how nice my wife is. For that reason, let's just jump directly to the monster encounter. The first time Sue and I took a vacation together was to Drummond Island in the most northern part of Michigan. In fact, Drummond Island is actually north of some parts of Canada, and right across the water from it as well. We were camping in the middle of the island in a campsite that isn't open any longer, sadly, although there are still some campgrounds there last I heard, and it's a great place to go on vacation. Sue grew up in a few different places in Ontario, and her family had camped on Drummond Island when she was a kid. But her main reason to drag me there was that she wanted me to see the sunrise from the steps at Marblehead. It's an eastward-facing cliff over the water where it feels like you're looking off into infinity. Actually, Coburn Island in Canada is just a few miles to the east. We had a romantic sunrise and Sue was satisfied. The sky was all sorts of colors and only barely beginning to light up when we started our long walk back in the direction of our campground. We knew it would take an hour or longer if we took our time about it, and once we got back we planned to eat and then sleep the afternoon away. But all our plans of leisure and romance ended abruptly as we heard it sound like a woman screaming in pain and horror. We both looked at each other like, what was that? But before we could say anything, the ground began trembling as though dozens of horses were heading toward us through the woods which surrounded us. Instinctively, we both began heading for the edge of the path, hoping to run into the woods and find a tree to hide behind or possibly climb up into. Another scream of that poor woman made us leap into the air, as it was far closer this time. I've never heard a cry like that before. It was so terrible that I'd call it worse than a horror movie scream. She sounded like she was being torn apart, and the rumbling of the earth only increased as well. Sue and I learned in that moment that our instincts are not always the most spot on. As we ran toward the trees, we saw them shaking, and we stood still, confused. Were we in an earthquake? I didn't know what direction to move in, and neither did Sue. And then we saw the source of the rumbling. We saw what was causing the ground to shake. Pushing trees to either side, we witnessed the largest ape we'd ever seen barreling out of the woods in our direction. It screamed and sounded like a woman being murdered. This was the source of the entire disturbance. It wasn't an earthquake, and it wasn't a woman. It was an ape, possibly 7 feet off the ground at its shoulder, running on all fours and about to trample us. We turned and ran back the way we came, which was probably not the best idea. You know how in Godzilla movies people run away from the giant monsters instead of just moving out of its way and letting it pass? That was us on that day. Instead of moving sideways into the woods and allowing this insane screaming beast to pass us by, we ran back toward the cliff we had watched the sunrise from. It seemed like seconds until we were back at the cliff's edge, facing a drop steep enough to end both our stories if we fell over. There was no place else to run to, and we turned to face this crazy-looking ape, something like a baboon with the longest snout that a gorilla-type thing could ever have. Its eyes looked absolutely insane, and poor Sue was crying. We both knew we were in trouble, and I looked around desperately, trying to find a way out. The big baboon was going to run us right off the cliff, unless we found a way to save ourselves. But then, we found out what the giant ape was running from, as he was leaped upon from behind by the largest wolf on planet Earth. This thing was as large as a horse, and the two of these creatures rolled off to the side, allowing my then-girlfriend and me to move a bit away from the cliff and hide ourselves behind a large tree. After we'd caught our breath, I made a motion to continue through the woods and work ourselves away from this absurd battle, but Sue grabbed me and pulled me back behind the tree. "Don't attract their attention," she whispered. "Just hide here with me and let them do each other in." She was right. We could make our escape when we weren't so close to the fighting. If we ran past them then, we might have made them lose interest in each other and come take a bite out of us instead. So we watched as the two really big animals rolled and punched and kicked and gouged at each other with fangs and claws and sheer strength. After some considerable wrestling on the dirt, the ape creature broke away from the large canine and picked up something off the ground. As strange as it may sound, it was one of those very old large flashlights. I had a brief and absurd thought that the big monkey was going to try to blind the dog with the light, but its tool use was not on that level of evolution yet, apparently. It swung the flashlight around like a weapon, brandishing it fiercely as it stood up on its hind legs, and that monster was monster size. He must have been 11 or 12 feet tall when he was bipedal, and now he had the height advantage over the huge wolf. But then, the most amazing part of this incident happened. The wolf stood up, as in stood up on its hind legs, and now the two beasts were both roughly the same height. Charging the ape-man bipedally, the dogman endured some harsh blows with the flashlight until he could get in close enough to snap his prehistoric-looking jaws around the neck of the immense ape. Flowing naturally with the dogman's movements, like the most highly trained martial artist, the ape simply fell backward and threw the dogman, who somersaulted and somehow landed on his two hind legs like a gymnast. These beasts may have been large enough to shake the ground and bounce the two of us up in the air in the process, but they were as swift and agile as much smaller kinds of animals. When the giant monkey allowed the dogman to get in close, the canine's teeth and claws tore at him, taking the advantage away. This is, I suppose, why the ape pushed away at the dog, repeatedly slipping away and picking things up off the ground to throw at him. The ape had the advantage of an opposable thumb, so he could toss rocks and debris up in the face of the dogman. The big wolf, on the other hand, had dog paws, not hands, so his only means of doing damage was to get in close enough to bite and tear at him with his teeth and his long, Wolverine-like claws. Okay, now in the years and years since this happened, as I mentioned before, my wife has done some research and shared her findings with me. I doubt I'm going to be informing many of you of things you don't already know, but we have become convinced that we witnessed a battle between a Dogman and a Googway type of Sasquatch. Some people have written that Googway are often mistaken for Dogman, or may even be a type of Dogman. But the Dogman we saw was not the kind with hands on his front limbs. This huge canine creature we saw was the kind that Linda Godfrey described in her book, The Beast of Bray Road, which my wife keeps next to our bed and quotes from on occasion. This is the type that is equally at home on all fours or up on its hind legs, although it usually only resorts to quadrupedal travel when it needs to reach top speed. In our case, when the Dogman was attempting to catch the Googway, it was down on all fours, but when it was once again battling the creature, it stood up at its full height. As for the idea of Googway being Dogman, I guess everything depends on context. If we had seen the Googway alone, who knows how we might have interpreted it. But as it was, standing right next to the upright walking canine, this creature looked like a big Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The legs were more like human legs, and the large feet, although not exactly like human feet, were certainly more human than canine. I don't recall it having hand-like feet the way many apes and monkeys do, so I don't believe that this was a tree-dwelling creature. Let's face it, that big boy would break most branches it attempted to alight on. I'm not good at judging the weight of animals by looking at them, but each of these creatures was as big as an adult bull or bison, and how much do those weigh? So, if what we saw was in fact a Googway, and we both feel strongly that it was, then a Googway must be a kind of a Bigfoot. The Dogman was purely canine. It had canine front limbs that it held in front of itself as though it were sort of praying as it walked. The arms were not human in any way, and they did not hang to either side as our arms do. It did not possess a wide muscular chest like a bodybuilder either. I hear people describing Dogman that way all the time, including on your channel. I do not question people who report such things, but that is not what we saw. So another conclusion to draw from all of this is that there must be multiple types of creatures being reported as Dogman. I suspect there are such different types of Dogman that some of them cannot even interbreed and are really different species. Some may be more closely related to Bigfoot or humans, while others are purely canine in makeup and creation. That was the kind we saw, and that was the kind that the big monkey was losing this battle to. And make no mistake, he was losing. The Dogman, although not any larger than the ape, was twice as fierce. He fought like it was the most important thing he'd ever done. When his teeth weren't snapping at the big monkey's softer parts, his claws were attempting to rip the giant ape open. He growled and whined and barked fiercely, a flurry of activity. At this stage in the fighting, the ape only struck out at the dog when he absolutely had to, and even then it was more like he was pushing the dog away than hitting at him. The Googway kept slipping away from the Dogman in order to fling things in the canine's face. One time he flung a rock at him. Another time he scooped up some dirt and threw it in the dog's eyes to give him another chance to get away. Each time the long-snouted Sasquatch almost slipped away, the Dogman was on him in seconds, pulling him back into the ongoing savage skirmish. I never saw anything so brutal, and I grew up in Chicago. When the Dogman and the Googway fought on that night, they put the nastiest gangs in the worst neighborhoods to shame. Well, except for maybe the Mexican drug cartel gangs, but those guys are too scary even for this channel. We saw the Googway make a break for it, and then heard that agonized sound of a woman screaming again when the Dogman leaped onto his back and sunk his considerably long fangs deep into the ape-like beast's massive, muscular shoulder. Something about this attack flipped a switch in the Googway's monkey brain, and he quickly became enraged before our eyes. It was like witnessing beast mode beasts as both of them upped the ante, attacking each other even more savagely than before. There was fur flying as the Dogman attacked again and again, and the Bigfoot took each opportunity to grab the dog and hurl it. He would deflect the Dogman into a tree. He would throw rocks at his face. He would grab him and swing him around and release, throwing him dozens of feet to one horrible landing after another. That Googway would have ended the life of any other creature that he fought in such a manner, but the Dogman would rise up again after each fall, as though this were gymnastics practice. Nothing seemed to slow the giant wolf creature down, and I didn't see how the Googway had any chance at all of winning this war between the cryptids. At one point, the Sasquatch had his back to the cliff, and the Dogman leaped at his throat. The Bigfoot fell backward to throw the Dogman again, but he hadn't taken into account how close he was to the edge of that very tall rock cliff. The two great beasts plunged over the edge, plummeting down to the hard, cold rocks far below and out of our sight. Sue gasped and ran toward the cliff before I could grab her and make her stop. I ran after, but when the two immense beasts landed below, the ground shook so mightily that I had to grab Sue and pull her back from the edge to prevent both of us from tipping over as well. "How could anything have survived that?" asked Sue. I wasn't sure if that was a rhetorical question, but I answered anyway, saying, "Nothing could have survived that, and we'd better get away, or we'd be goners too." I remember how we were sort of half in shock as we walked for over an hour back to our campsite. I was so dazed that I didn't even notice the sun had fully come up until we were all the way back. We made some breakfast and then sat there, still quite stunned. Then Sue asked me if I got any good pictures of the monsters. Pictures? Taking pictures was kind of the last thing on my mind during that incident, I confessed. I hadn't even thought to take pictures, and I asked her if she had taken any. No, she hadn't either. I never used to believe any cryptid story or UFO sighting that people talked about if they hadn't taken photos. But that was because I had never actually had one of those experiences before. Now I know why it's so rare for anyone to get any evidence of one of these experiences. You're kind of more concerned with your own survival than you are with the idea of opening up your camera app and all that. It was humbling to realize how frightened I'd been. I was too scared to move, at points when it had been my job to protect my wife and myself from danger. I learned a lot about my limitations on that morning. So I started this off talking about how this incident changed me. That wasn't something I noticed myself, but Sue pointed it out to me. She says that before we almost lost our lives that early morning to the Dogman and the Googway, I was the kind of young man who felt he knew everything. I also felt, according to my better half at least, that I knew better than everyone else. I didn't accept this until she reminded me how I had laughed in the face of her Uncle Joe when he told us about his Bigfoot sighting years earlier. I had forgotten about all that, and it was quite embarrassing to be reminded of it. Her Uncle Joe and I became good friends after we had our cryptid incident, however. I had not ever consciously noticed that change, but Sue did. She says that these days I actually listen to people when they talk. I no longer finish other people's sentences for them, and I no longer assume I know more than they do. It may sound like I'm bragging, but actually, I find it much harder to brag than I did in my youth. When you have a humbling experience like Sue and I did, you realize how lucky you are to wake up each ensuing day. And those of us still lucky to wake up healthy have twice as much to be grateful for. It's not something you can just assume or expect, you know. You can't expect health, and you have to carefully protect and guard every chance you have at happiness. You have to make that happiness out of whatever you've got. In this case, that which did not kill us made Sue and me stronger, and I didn't even notice until she pointed it out that we're both much happier than we were in those bad old days. Things have never been the same since the day I almost didn't survive. The Dogman versus Googway battle in northern Michigan. Dogman versus 15-foot Bigfoot. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had an adventure that was directly inspired by one of your earlier shows, at least in a sense. You told of some people who camped out near a mystery spot in Montana, I think, who then had a Dogman experience. We have our own mystery spot near Lake Michigan, within a couple hours driving distance from where I live. So I tried to talk all my friends, any of my friends, into going camping with me up there in those woods to see what cryptids we might find. They were all busy working jobs that they hadn't been able to work due to the medical situation, so everyone was too busy working to go goof off with me. I ended up going to the mystery spot alone, and I almost got myself crushed out of existence during the epic battle between Dogman and the 15-foot Bigfoot. I took the Mackinac Bridge north, ready to begin my adventure. When I got there, I parked my car near the mystery spot and then walked over there, sizing the place up, but not getting the tour, which I planned to do the following day. Then, I wandered off into the woods to find a secret place to camp. There's a pretty nice-sized forest over there, and you can sometimes see some cool animals, too. It's across the water from an island where the St. Helena Island Nature Preserve is located, and past that, on the opposite shore of the mainland, is Wilderness State Park, plus the Headlands International Dark Sky Park. You simply don't know what you might run into in northern Michigan, and I looked forward to the kinds of dreams that might come that night. Well, I didn't get to sleep at all that night. In fact, I didn't get to sleep until I was in the hospital the next day, due to the real-life waking nightmare that I'm about to relate to you. I was eating my dinner in front of my campfire just a little past dusk, when the night was beginning to grow completely dark. I heard a crashing through some trees, and I heard a blood-curdling scream that started off sounding like a woman and ended up deeper than the deepest voice of the largest man. I never heard anything like that before in my life, and I bounced to my feet, utterly surprised, not understanding what was happening. Through the woods pushed a creature that was actually taller than some of the trees, moving them out of the way like a punk making his way to the front of the crowd to see his favorite band. I have no idea if that'll mean anything to you if you're reading this in the future after crowds are permanently banned for our health, quote-unquote. Let's just say he unceremoniously and abruptly inserted himself into my life with no warning. This was an upright ape man, like a chimpanzee with Bigfoot-sized feet, who had excellent posture, standing up straight and tall like Superman, even though he appeared to be an ape and not a man at all. I suppose this was Bigfoot, but it was a very anthropoid-looking one. I mean, the face was all monkey and not human at all in any way. It did not have monkey or ape feet. It had big, wide Bigfoot feet. So I'm going to call it a Sasquatch of some kind. Whatever he was, he marched across the short field and showed no fear of my campfire whatsoever. Whatever he was, he marched across that short field and showed no fear of my campfire whatsoever. Reaching out one ridiculously long simian arm, he grabbed me around the torso with just one of his giant hands, and he lifted me up to his face, screaming at me the way my mother used to do when I would talk back to her. My entire body was the size of this Bigfoot's face. Can you imagine being pulled through the air into a face as big as you? He could swallow me in one gulp, 2 at the most. I tried to break free, but his one hand was stronger than my entire body. The only other time I felt that powerless was the time I got handcuffed, but that's a story for a different time. I was certain I was done for. The Bigfoot was opening its mouth so far to scream that I could see part of the way down its throat. This was an end-of-the-world nightmare for me. And then, as suddenly as he had started, the ape-man stopped screaming at me and stared at me quizzically. He began sniffing me all over, opening his hand a little bit to allow himself access to smell my torso, my midsection, and my legs. He looked at me with a confused expression, then smelled me all over again. I had no idea what was going on at that moment, but he seemed to be thinking. It looked like the biological computers inside this guy's brain were doing calculations. Whatever he decided, I sensed he was no longer angry at me. Holding me close to his chest, the great beast began running at what seemed like great speed away from my campfire and through the forest. My face and my left ear were pressed to his massive rib cage, and I got a good whiff of Bigfoot's sweat as we ran. I could hear his heart beating madly in his chest, as well as his giant lungs doing the breathing of 3 men all at once. I could not see where we were going. I could only make out a blur of green whizzing by as we tore through the forest, moving forward at insane speeds. When we stopped, I was placed up high in a tree where I clung onto the trunk for dear life. I am not a tree climber, and I discovered in that part of all this that I do in fact have a fear of heights. I was maybe only 35-40 feet up, but I couldn't figure out how to get down. There was only one set of branches beneath me, and then a drop that was taller than the Sasquatch. If he was 15 feet, then I would probably have had to drop 20 or 25 feet to the ground, even if I made it down to those branches beneath me before I jumped. Then, I started looking upward at the branches above me, wondering if I could climb higher and get away from the Bigfoot that way. Even looking up made my head spin and my vision spiral. I wasn't sure I could succeed in climbing higher, and at best, it would only be a temporary solution. I was so consumed with fear and so shaken up that it took all my concentration just to hold my position in that tree. I was not viewing escape as something feasible to attempt. I was pure quivering jelly. I was a mess. I was defeated. I was fully immersed in cowardice. And I was that giant Sasquatch's captive. Enter Dogman. I don't know exactly how this happened because I was up in that tree, focused on my own situation and contemplating how to escape. But suddenly the Bigfoot crashed into the tree below me, almost knocking me loose and causing me to fall. As I clung on for dear life, I saw that he hadn't lost his balance. He had been pushed into the tree via an attack from another hairy creature. The Bigfoot charged forward away from the tree to return the favor, and I strained to get into a position where I could see this fight better. I carefully squatted down on my branch and tore some leaf-filled twiggy branches out of my line of vision, giving me a better view of the small clearing my tree was set at the edge of. And that is when I understood for the first time that I was looking at a North American upright walking canine, more commonly known as a dogman. As I watched this creature bark and snarl and bare his long, prehistoric-looking fang-like teeth at the much taller Sasquatch, I rubbed my eyes to make sure I wasn't confused about what I was seeing. No, that was a dog-headed ape-man. It was not a smaller Sasquatch. It was also not a bear. Most of my friends have told me that I saw a bear, and some of them won't even talk to me anymore because I won't agree with them. I'll tell you the same thing I told them. Bears aren't gray. They're brown or they're black. If you're way up north, then maybe they're white or blondish, but they don't come in gray. Wolves come in gray, and this thing was some sort of wolf that stood up on its hind legs. Now certain of what I was seeing, I was still completely confused as to why these two giants were fighting, or what they were fighting over. My body froze in fear, wondering if they were fighting over custody of me. It was a little hard for me to judge height while staring almost straight down at this battle, but the Dogman seemed to be about half the size of the Bigfoot. If the Squatch was 15 feet, then maybe the Dogman was something like 7. He definitely padded around on dog paw feet, but I don't want to say that they were small feet. Small compared to the Bigfoot, sure, but they call them big feet for a reason. The werewolf or man-wolf had paws larger than those of your average dog. For some reason I could not explain, these two alpha males were engaging in a most serious battle. Each of them appeared ready to terminate the other one, if that was what it took to win. The dog sounded insanely furious, and it was clear that the ape man didn't like the Dogman very much either. They both sounded like monsters, ready to destroy. They both seemed to accept that this might be the battle that might end their story for good. This might be the fight that their entire life had led up to, and which they would never be able to walk away from. The 15-foot-tall Bigfoot had his hands balled up into fists, or something very much like a human fist, and he hauled off and clocked that Dogman in the jaw, knocking the beast clear off his back legs and into some foliage. The blow would have crushed me. I didn't think I would have ever recovered from that, and I assumed that the Bigfoot had just ended this fight in the first round. To my surprise, the Dogman wasn't only still alive, he was still in the fight. Running out of the bushes and circling around behind the Bigfoot, the bipedal canine leaped up in the air and onto the Sasquatch back, digging his claws in and eliciting squealing, pained shouting from the ape-like monster. The Bigfoot lurched forward, trying to throw the Dogman over his shoulder, but those claws were dug too deep in his flesh to let go. The Bigfoot screamed so loud that it hurt my ears, and it flailed about almost as if it were on fire. Then it fell backward, crunching that Dogman between him and the ground. Standing up again, the Dogman had been knocked almost unconscious by the unexpected attack, but his long, sharp claws were embedded so deeply in the Bigfoot that he hung there like dead weight, creating an even more painful situation for the giant ape man. He spun in circles, trying to reach behind him and dislodge the canine monster, but he could not reach it, even with his extra long arms. Whatever he did only caused himself more pain. Spinning around madly, insanely, painfully out of control, the huge Sasquatch, quite by accident, slammed the Dogman sideways into a tree, and the canine came loose and fell to the ground. He appeared quite winded and kept shaking his head as though trying to shake off whatever damage the Sasquatch had just caused. As the bellowing, furious Bigfoot charged forward with clenched fists, the Dogman recovered in time to stand in a defensive position and flail his arms wildly in front of him, his claws out. The Bigfoot attempted to land punches while the Dogman defended by swinging his open-clawed attack, trying to slice those fists before they could do damage. As I watched from the tree, I wondered which of the two beasts I actually wanted to see win this fight. I got myself upset all over again with the answer I heard in my head and my heart, which was, I don't want to see either of these monsters win. In neither case would the win be good for me in any way. No matter which of them won, I was the loser. For this reason, bravery began to grow inside me about revisiting my thinking concerning trying to escape from this situation in some way. Immediately, I maneuvered my body while holding onto my branch so that I could drop down, hanging underneath the thick branch, holding on with my two hands and attempting to swing to the lower branch and drop down onto that. Again, this would only bring me 10 feet closer to the grass below, but it would satisfy my need to do something. I couldn't stand by and do nothing any longer. Ignoring what was happening between the Dogman and the Bigfoot, I swung myself back and forth, and then I let go, hoping the momentum would carry me to where I wanted to go. I was pretty surprised when my feet landed exactly where I wanted them to, directly on top of the branch I aimed for. I was even more surprised when they slipped off and I slipped straight down, catching myself with my two hands and my chin, which took a great deal of the brunt of it. That hurt so much that I almost passed out. I knew I had to climb up onto that branch again, but I was in so much pain that I needed to hold still and wait and endure the throbbing agony that I was experiencing. It didn't just hurt on my chin, but my neck hurt from the minor whiplash, and the back of my skull was experiencing a major headache. It was excruciating, just take my word for it. I was in blinding pain, but I didn't think I had endured any real damage. I hung on for dear life, immersed in the throbbing pain as it rose and fell. Soon, when it fell, it was almost gone, but then it ramped up again to agony equal to before. I had to continue to relax my head and face muscles while keeping my arms fully tensed around that branch to prevent any further injury. As the pain began to subside more and more, I was able to take in my surroundings a bit better. The battle between the two creatures was still raging, with the Bigfoot on offense, punching away, and the far smaller Dogman on defense, ducking down under the blows and swinging his dangerous claws wildly at the fists whenever they came close enough. I wanted to jump down, but it was a bigger drop than I'd ever experienced before in my life. I didn't know if I could do it without twisting an ankle or worse. I was never the most athletic or graceful person, and I could not envision in my mind how I could possibly come out of that drop unharmed. Nevertheless, I was going to have to get my courage up enough to try. My arms were by then hurting more than my head. I wasn't going to be able to hold on all that much longer anyway. And then, the situation was decided for me. The Dogman took advantage of a lapse in the Bigfoot's attack, and he leaped forward, this time planting his claws deep in the Bigfoot's chest and belly. The 15-foot-tall Sasquatch staggered backward, moaning a horrible sound, and his back slammed hard into my tree, dislodging me and sending me plummeting toward the hard ground below. I landed on both feet, then allowed my legs to go limp beneath me, hoping against hope that I wouldn't break every bone in them by doing so. Well, my legs were fine, but my left ankle had twisted around a bit, and once again I was in severe, shocking levels of agony. I remember looking up to see if either of the creatures noticed my fall, as my hands wrapped around my ankle, feeling for broken bones. I watched as the Bigfoot turned to see me lying on the ground, and then the Dogman plunged his teeth deep into the ape-man's throat, causing him to have to focus on his werewolf opponent instead of on me. I still was not sure if the Dogman was even aware of my presence, although I worried that he was fighting the anthropoid over me. My fear overtook my pain, and I began to crawl on all fours away from the fighting. I remember hearing the dog snarling and the Bigfoot wailing in horror and unhappiness. In my mind, that Dogman seemed to be winning, and I was filled with panic that he would chase me down and eat me up before I could get very far away. While my main goal was to get out of Dodge, I also kept my eyes open for any possible hiding spot. While looking around for a cave or some such thing, my eyes fell upon a thick stick on the forest floor that looked tall enough for me to use as a sort of cane. Leaning on a tree, I climbed back up on my legs, and using my makeshift cane, I was able to slowly and painfully walk upright away from the fighting behind me. It was about then that I heard the sound of a large canine who had just gotten hurt, and in my imagination that meant the Squatch may have turned the tide. This did not calm me in the slightest, however. I was just as panicked at the idea of either of them winning. By this time, I was just hoping the fight would continue. I wanted them focused on each other, and not on me. I remember staggering out of the woods and onto a road. It must have been Martin Lake Road, and I remember flashing lights. I was told later that I had been rescued by a state trooper, but I don't actually have any memory of that part of what happened. I woke up in a hospital being rehydrated in a bed. They told me that my ankle was not seriously injured, and that if I went easy on it, I should be able to walk out of the hospital that same day. That is, if the hospital's shrink decided I was mentally stable enough to leave. Hospitals to me feel like prisons, so I got my act together and I made up some story to tell the shrink. It was a story that had no giant monsters in it, believe me. It was a story with a happy ending that I delivered in the calmest and most rational way I could manage. I made eye contact, but not too much eye contact. I smiled, but I didn't smile too much, and I was allowed to return to freedom within a few hours. Once I was out of the clutches of the authorities, though, I got on my phone and started telling all my friends what really happened. Some of them won't talk to me anymore because of this. They think I've lost my mind. That's not true, but I did almost lose my life on the day when I was forced to watch the battle of Dogman versus the 15-foot Bigfoot. 15-foot Bigfoot versus the Dogman family. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have a story of an incident I witnessed in Wilderness State Park of a family of Michigan dogmen having some sort of a turf battle with the 15-foot Bigfoot that you talk about on your channel. I had seen the Dogman before years back, and I'll tell you about that experience. I also am related to people who have seen the 15-foot Bigfoot, as you call him. So let me tell you about those older encounters first, so that when I tell you about the big battle I witnessed, you'll know what I knew going into it. First of all, I want to say that my family has known for generations that 15-foot Bigfoot is a thing. My father and my grandfather have both had direct experiences with this creature. He is an old bull Sasquatch. My grandfather says there is no limit how big they can become if they get enough of what they want and need. In other words, because he basically has no predators coming after him, or at least none that have been able to take him down so far. And because he has all the food he needs, he just keeps getting bigger year after year. Mainstream zoologists like to suggest that there isn't enough food available in rural areas in the United States for predators this large to subsist, but the existence of the 15-foot Bigfoot suggests otherwise, at least if one presumes he does in fact exist. In my opinion, there very well could be not one, but several Bigfoot that immense in this one area, living large off the land. I've got a story or two to tell you in support of this argument, but those didn't happen directly to me. I'd like to start off with my first experience with a Dogman. This was years back when I was 20 years old, with my girlfriend, camping out in our secret beach spot. A little bit south and a little bit further west of Cecil, there is a tiny, secret little sandy beach hidden in the woods. It's surrounded in 360 degrees by forest and shrubbery, except for one little spot that opens up and lets you out onto the lagoon, as my girlfriend and I used to call it. On both far ends, the lake cuts off sharply, so I assume it must have been built here by men years ago. I'm guessing it was built to capture rainwater because this lake or reservoir is right along an official forest trail. It's unlike any other place I've ever set up a tent, and it had been my favorite place to camp out with a few different girlfriends. I'm about to tell you about the last time I camped out there, and you'll understand why I won't go back by the time I'm done telling you this story. So this girl and I were having a good time hanging out on a blanket on the sand outside our tent. It was a hot day, so we kept going for swims to cool off, followed by hangout sessions on the blanket to get hot all over again. It had started to get dark and we could hear a wind blowing through the trees that sounded like a storm might be coming our way. We were debating heading inside the tent when the silhouette of a large figure crashed into the opening in the vegetation that led to the water. It was like an NFL linebacker. It was a huge guy. At first I thought I was seeing a zombie rising from the grave because this guy had stuff hanging off him and dripping off him. My girlfriend was screaming loudly, and I probably was too, at least at first. I mean, he appeared out of nowhere, so we were startled. Then, when we looked at him, we got a lot more scared. As the big guy lurched into our private little beach area, we could see him far more clearly. The stuff dangling off him was the same kind of seaweed that littered the beach, only the ones hanging from this guy were dripping wet. So was he. Dripping wet, I mean. It seemed to weigh down his steps, the fact that he was carrying so much more weight in water, pouring off his long fur. Yes, whoever this was, he was covered in fur. It looked like he was wearing the pelt of a large wolf, leading up to a cowl made from the fur of that same, or an identically colored wolf. As the man entered onto the sand, he lifted his head to look at the woods past us, and we could see for the first time that the fur he was wearing was the fur he was born with. This was not a man wearing skins. This was a beast that walked like a man. I remember us scampering out of his way as he seemed interested in something behind us. As long as he wasn't interested in us, that was fine with me. He had glowing eyes like a cat, but this was a wolf. It was a wolf that walked upright like a man, but it was a wolf of some kind. He took slow, heavy step after slow, heavy, dripping wet step, laboring through our campsite, never once looking at us or acknowledging that we were even there. As it reached the trees behind us, it reached its front legs out to hold the trunks aside enough for him to slip between the vegetation and lumber off slowly into the woods. We were staring after him, stunned and shocked, but largely relieved that we had survived an encounter with the Michigan Dogman. I remember I was literally panting, as though I had just run for a mile. My girlfriend said, "We should get inside the tent." Then, another, smaller, darker, upright wolf creature ran quickly in from the water and dove into the woods, following the larger one. As slowly as the first one had plodded through, that's how fast the second one ran through. I didn't even notice if that one was wet. My girlfriend started packing up. She didn't feel like that would be a safe place to sleep, at least not on that night. We didn't speak at all till we hiked all the way back to our car. But, once inside, we discussed all our theories about what we had seen. Maybe the large one was a parent and the second one was its child. Even the smaller one was not small. It had to have been between 5 and 6 feet tall. The fact that both of them ran on their hind legs demonstrates that this was not a fluke. It was not something that the first one did because of injured front legs or anything like that. This seemed to be two members of a Dogman family, and it seemed they both naturally walked on their hind legs. My girlfriend also thought the second one might have been a female, a mate of the first one. I didn't really check or notice the gender of either of them, so I suppose I can't say her theory is incorrect. I think they were both males, though, but that's just based on my gut instinct. Another thing we talked about a lot back then was how the Dogman just came up out of the water. It's not like that was a river outside, it was a reservoir. At least in theory, it shouldn't connect to anywhere. The only way to get to that place should be over land. So did the creatures walk there, take a dip in the pool to cool off, same as me and my girlfriend, then head out on their way? Could be. Some people think that Loch Ness is either a dimensional portal or time machine, explaining both the appearance and disappearances of Nessie that way. For years they wondered if there was a connection underwater to some other waterway. Could something like that be going on in that little lagoon over there southwest of Cecil? Whatever we actually witnessed, I was left with a deep conviction that not only are the Michigan Dogman real, but they are a real species. I saw 2 of them. How many more might there be? So, I had never even seen a juvenile Sasquatch, let alone a 15-foot Bigfoot, before my experience in the Wilderness State Park that I'm going to tell you about coming up. But I had heard stories about these giants from both my father and my grandfather. The tale my grandfather told involves hunting and violence and things that YouTube doesn't like. So that story is our secret uncensored story for today, available only to channel members and PayPal subscribers. But I can tell you my father's experience with the 15-foot Bigfoot, and so I shall, right now. My father's cryptid story happened while he was driving past the mystery spot at night as a dare when he was much younger. He told me they had another word or a term they used to call that place back then, but he couldn't remember what it was. It was something like portal or vortex, but it wasn't those words specifically. I'm not sure if he meant this was a word or term that his friends would call it amongst themselves, or if it was some official name for the place. Maybe he didn't know either. At any rate, the way it went was that supposedly if you drove down the road in front of the mystery spot at midnight and you honked your horn 3 times, you'd see a different world forming around you, like a different dimension or reality was hardening in every direction. Then you had to drive out of there at once or else you'd get locked into that other world, whatever it was. I asked my father what that other world was supposed to be. How was it different from our world? He shook his head, looking like he was still freaked out about it, even all those years since. You don't even want to know, he told me, looking so deadly serious that I almost laughed out loud at him. He wasn't joking around, though, and he rarely gets all grim like that. He seemed to really mean the story when he told it, so, as unbelievable as it sounded to me as a kid first hearing about it, I still figured there must be some truth behind this one. So, in the story, my father got pushed into driving the car, although I think he said it was someone else's car he was driving. Dad was considered the best driver, or maybe else the only sober one, but in any case, they wanted the most alert person behind the wheel. Any hesitation might lead to them all getting trapped in a vortex or alternate Twilight Zone dimension of sight and sound or something. Dad told me that he felt so nervous, it was like he was the getaway driver for a bank robbery. The plan was to drive a few blocks into the area past the mystery spot, make a U-turn, and then, when they were facing in the correct direction to leave and ready to peel out of there in case of an emergency, then, and only then would they beep the horn and wait to see if anything changed. It didn't work out that way, however. Dad said he drove into the area still a few blocks from the planned U-turn, and then without warning, a massive giant figure ran out from behind some trees into the road in front of them. Dad slammed on the brakes and the silhouetted giant began moving toward them. It had to be the size of 3 men, each standing on the other's shoulders. Dad drove backward, trying to put distance between the monster and that car. I interrupted his storytelling to make him stop and explain the monster to me. What did that mean, Dad, when you say it was a giant? My father got very emotional at me for pausing his narrative. He would always just tell it that way. He would say it was a giant. You weren't supposed to ask him what the giant looked like. Dad seemed angry at first, then sad, then frustrated, but he still wasn't telling me what the giant appeared like. When he finally started to explain it to me, he got really choked up and kept having to stop and regain his composure. He'd supply me with some detail, then tell me it was all just impossible. Every time he said the word impossible, it would make him weep all over again. Those of you who don't like it when a man cries, I feel sorry for you. My father was a veteran of overseas combat, and he was not afraid to cry in front of his son. What he went through traumatized him, and he was unable to talk about it without the trauma resurfacing. So, the short version of what happened is that from somewhere behind the mystery spot, out ran this Mighty Joe Young type figure. Its face wasn't entirely ape-like, however, it had some very human qualities to its eyes, its cheeks, and its nose. It was like a Bigfoot, but it was twice the size of a Bigfoot. It was, as my father kept repeating, impossibly large. He said it was the abominable snowman from Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, except it was dark like a gorilla, and it wasn't funny at all. Even as a kid, when my father told this story, I wondered if it was a Paul Bunyan tale, or the story of Santa Claus or something like that. But Dad would get so much more emotional when talking about the 15-foot Bigfoot that it sure seemed more like a true story to me. He didn't call it 15-foot Bigfoot. I know that's your name that your channel made up or invented or whatever, but my father used to call it Big Daddy. Probably less confusing if I just keep calling it by your name than his. Try to imagine being a young adult in a car full of other young adults, and you're all out to scare each other that night. It's a little spooky. It's a little scary. Each of you is wondering if any of the others have set up an ambush scare. You're all half ready to scream like in a dark ride at the amusement park. And then, suddenly, a 15-foot tall Bigfoot runs out in front of you. Something that couldn't be a man in a suit. Something that couldn't be fake. Something that couldn't have been set up by any of the other people in the car with you. The appearance of this beast man has thrown you into momentary shock as your mind struggles to accept this new paradigm. Now you aren't just scared. Now your lives are literally in danger. Looking down, you remember that you're the driver of this car. You put your arm over the back of your seat and twist around to look as far behind you as possible. Then, you begin driving backward, away from the impossibly large Sasquatch. After just a few seconds of progress, you realize you aren't moving backward any longer. Turning around, you can see the entire front windshield filled with the massive form of the oversized Bigfoot. He has one giant hand on either side of your car's front end, and he's holding your wheels far enough up off the ground that this front-wheel drive vehicle isn't going anywhere that Bigfoot doesn't want it to go. This is the point when, according to my father, the Sasquatch held the car, tilted up to his face, glared in at my dad, right in his eyes, and then screamed at him. Either he also shook the car with his hands while screaming, or perhaps the decibel level of the display was of enough intensity to shake the car on its own. In either case, once he was done, the 15-foot Bigfoot released his grip on the vehicle, allowing it to freefall and slam hard back into terra firma. By the time he and his friends finished bouncing and banging back down to earth, Bigfoot was already walking off into the night like a giant gangster. Anyone can have a mic drop moment, but only he can do it with a car. So even though I wasn't sure that anything my father told me about concerning the Big Daddy Bigfoot was actually true, I had a sinking feeling it might be. I wanted to believe that it was my father misremembering a nightmare or something, but whenever I'd be in the woods, I'd look around and wonder, what would it look like if a 15-foot Bigfoot ran out into the scene with no warning right now? Because, think about it, that was how my father told the story. They were driving down the road, and then this freak ran out and lifted up the front end of the car with no reason or warning. So, I always tried to imagine this Mighty Joe Young monster was around wherever I was. What would I do if he jumped out of hiding and came for me? And what would you do? I used to have a group of friends that would regroup each summer for at first a week, and later a long weekend of camping. The last time we got together was the summer of 2015. You know, it's funny. Back then, even though we all had different political convictions, we were able to joke about them and still remain good friends. It's true that we ran into something horrible in those woods that summer, but the reason we haven't met up again since then has nothing to do with cryptids. We were camping in Wilderness State Park, and you know how the Bigfoot ran out at my father as he drove that car in his story? Well, in my case, my friend had just succeeded in lighting our campfire, for which he was rewarded with a rousing hand of applause from the rest of us present. As if on cue, out of the woods crashed a huge brown hairy mountain of movement, with no face. How could his entire head have no features? What was I looking at? Crashing out of the tree line, I could see the creature's butt was up front, and his legs were backward. Or, more likely, he was facing the other direction and walking backward. Before I could finish wrapping my mind around this, I saw 2 dogs run out of the woods after the moving hair mountain. Once they cleared the tree line, the dogs raised up on their back legs and ran into the clearing. They were gray wolves walking upright, and it was apparent to me that these were the same species which had interrupted my former girlfriend and myself that night on the beach. Only these dogmen were not acting like the zombified older dogman that night. These were both sharp, fast, and aggressive like that second one that had darted through after the first. While my friend screamed, I froze in shock and watched the creatures squaring off in battle. 2 dogmen against 1 Sasquatch twice their height. How was it possible I was witnessing this? Someone grabbed my shoulder sternly and I awoke from my reverie. The campfire was out and smoke was rising from it. Everyone was leaving. I was being urged to join the others who were fleeing the scene. I ran along with my friends toward the path we had walked to get in there. The car was in that direction. Having made it to the entrance of the trail, I felt less immediately in physical danger. I was only a short run from the car. In that position, I turned to witness the developing situation between these rarely seen cryptids. The 2 dogmen, in comparison to the Sasquatch, appeared tiny, but those dogmen were taller than I was by at least half a foot. The 2 of them behaved savagely, while the Bigfoot seemed to mostly just want to calm them down. It didn't seem as though he were trying to fight back at them, so much as to assuage them somehow. They took advantage of this, and as I watched, both dogs launched savage, violent attacks against the larger beast from both sides at once. I could see that their attacks were beginning to really hurt the Bigfoot, and he was running out of time and opportunities to fight back. Sometimes in life your opponents may calm down after a while, but other times your opponents are a pair of Michigan dogmen. I'm not sure why, but I was siding with the Sasquatch. When those dogs hurt him, it hurt me too. I wanted to see him get away from them, and that was not what I was seeing. I saw a rock on the ground that looked like a size that I could heave. I took aim at one of the dogmen and I fired away. The stone looped in the sky, and I thought for a moment I might hit the dogman in its posterior. But when it landed about halfway between me and that dogman, the only thing it thumped was the ground. And that ground thump instantly drew the fierce attention of all 3 apex predators who had been focused on each other throughout that scene. Suddenly silent, the trio stared at me as though they were hive-minded like the Borg. I turned and ran down the path, feeling like I was reenacting the Indiana Jones boulder scene. I was certain that if I wasn't clawed to death, then surely I'd be trampled upon. I saw my friends ahead. They were in and around the car, waving vigorously for me to get in. I wished I could teleport in that moment. I wished I could fly. All I could do was run. Slowly. But then, I noticed how all my friends were looking at me. They were looking right in my eyes. They weren't looking behind me or above me with worried expressions. They were looking at me with encouraging or annoyed expressions. Risking a look behind myself, I saw that the creatures were not only not on my tail, they were no longer in my view. I didn't know if they had run off, or if they were taking a shortcut and waiting to jump out and eat me. Just in case, I kept running as fast as I could and jumped into that car. We all stayed at one guy's house that night, then in the morning went back to investigate what was left of our camp. Well, everything was fine. They must have left when we left. The camp was exactly how we had left it. We did pack up and move from that location, but when people say that we stopped reuniting because of the Dogman or the Sasquatch, that just isn't true. We camped in a different location the next night, but we weren't afraid of camping or anything like that. It was a different kind of monster that's kept us apart since then. One far more evil than a cryptid could ever be. So, yes, I do think these things are real no matter what people in New York City may think. I have no choice but to admit this, because I was a witness to the battle of the 15-foot Bigfoot versus the Dogman family. 15-foot Bigfoot versus 7-yard Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I saw your 2 episodes about that so-called 15-foot Bigfoot, and all I can tell you is that we got even bigger monsters here in Texas. At least we did when I was a young man back in the 1970s, and that's no lie. I'm going to tell you about a 15-foot wood booger Sasquatch that I seen when I was coming back from Oklahoma on Route 66 in Shamrock, Texas, way back in 1973. And when I seen him, he was engaged in mortal combat with a Dogman that was even larger than he was. That summer, for my family, meant dealing with cryptids. We had been experiencing Bigfoot disturbances for a number of years by then. I guess it started in 67 or 68, and we would continue to see them off and on through the mid-1980s. But in 1973, we also had Dogman incidents. We didn't call them Dogman, though. We called them all sorts of different things. Sometimes werewolf, sometimes bear dog. Sometimes we just say that they was a wood booger with a dog face. Let me tell you about one of my Dogman experiences from 73 so that you can understand what I mean. Now, when I'm saying Dogman in this case, I mean one of the 6 or 6.5 foot tall man-shaped creatures with canine heads. I'm going to lead up to the story about the 20 or 25 foot one, don't worry, but that one was much taller than any of the other bipedal canines that we dealt with that year. On both my family's property and our next neighbor over's as well, livestock had been going missing. I know I thought it was the boogers, the Bigfoot, or else I thought it was a human because whoever got into both our chicken coops had to untie knots in order to do it. That demonstrates more intelligence than my Uncle Bean, who was never bright enough to be put in charge of minding chickens. I was a teenager at the time, and I got chosen to spend the night on guard, out by the animals, and chase off whoever or whatever was stealing our livestock. Well, of course, no sooner had I climbed into my sleeping bag than I fell asleep. I was dreaming that a pile of garbage was alive, and it was standing too close to me. I could hear it, sniffing me, which woke me up. I opened my eyes, and there was a big, fierce-looking head of some kind of prehistoric-looking wolf filling my field of vision. It had scars all over its snout, its brow ridge, and just beneath one eye. Several little tears were torn out of the edges of its upright, triangular, canine-style ears. I tried to back away, but I was lying belly up on the grass, so there was nowhere to back up to. The big wolf, looking down on me, drooled on me, and I screamed like a little girl. The wolf didn't like being shouted at, though, so he bellowed back at me. It wasn't a barking sound like a dog would make. It wasn't a howl, either. It wasn't really a very wolf-like sound to make at all, because it kind of roared. Or screamed, I guess you could say. It was a terrifying noise. It was deafeningly loud, and it felt like I was being hit all over by intense waves of rock-hard sound or air. The dog head reared back, and I saw that it was standing up on its hind legs, with one foot on either side of my sleeping bag. It glared down well over 6 feet at me, with eyes that literally glowed, like one of those old glow-in-the-dark watches from back then. Only his eyes were not so green. They were just shining bright, like white eyes. His fur was dark, but not like a black bear. It was longer and wavier than a black bear's fur. I watched in amazement, not moving a muscle due to being completely frozen in fear. The dogman looked at me in disgust, like I was something pathetic. And then he went in the chicken coop, chose a bird, twisted its neck, tucked it under his arm, and trotted away. I watched him take his time leaving, strolling bipedally into the forest from whence he apparently came. I tell you what, buddy, I never made any effort to pursue. In the morning, I refused to tell my parents what I had seen, but I did tell them I saw what took the chicken. I also informed them that we were going to need a much sturdier chicken coop, and that we were going to need some more sophisticated kind of a locking system. Maybe a combination lock, like what I used for my locker at school. Dad and I built a sturdier, thicker new coop, put a nice tough lock on it, and it took years before we lost any more birds to theft. We continued to see both the Sasquatch and the dog-headed monster things here and there. You'd hear stories that your neighbor or your sibling or your friend saw the upright walking dog dart across a dark road in front of them, things like that. In a similar manner, you'd hear stories about people seeing the big hairy wood monsters hiding behind thick trees and peeking out at them. One guy that I knew told me that 2 Bigfoot went through his garbage looking for food. I asked him if he wasn't mistaking bears for Bigfoot, but he told me that his trash receptacles were bear-proof. He claimed he saw these 2 big hairy humanoids tear open bear-proof garbage containers. From the late 60s to the mid-70s, this was the way it was around us. And then you just sort of stopped hearing about it as much, and you kind of stopped thinking about it. The werewolf flap was over by spring of '74 as far as I can remember. We did continue to hear about Bigfoot into the 1980s, but it was much more of an occasional thing than it had been from 68 through 74 or 75-ish. The biggest cryptid event of my life, and the craziest thing that I ever saw, as I've already told you, was the fight between a super tall Sasquatch and a dog-headed creature that was even larger than that. Here's how it all happened. I was driving home from Oklahoma after dark. I don't remember the date or time, but it was autumn of '73. I remember that the leaves of the trees back in Oklahoma were still there, but they weren't all green any longer. You know, that part of Oklahoma and Texas isn't really stereotypical looking. It has trees like they have up in Maine or New Hampshire. Not as many as they have up there, but they're just as beautiful. Most of them lose their leaves in the winter, and the only green trees left till spring over there are the kinds with pine cones. I remember all day out I was looking, noticing 2 trees here, 3 trees there, all changing color in their own individual ways, and I was noticing how beautiful it all was. I felt a chill as I thought about how different it all looked at night, though. In the bright sunshine, autumn looks like a celebration like Thanksgiving, but at night, when the cold breeze whistles through the landscape, autumn looks a whole lot more like Halloween. Then, as I crossed over the border from Oklahoma into Texas, the only trees were very far off in the distance, as the land in that area becomes very flat. Maybe I had got myself spooked out, but to me it still felt like Halloween out there that night. It wasn't much after having that thought that my gaze fell upon just exactly that, a bit of Halloween happening right outside my windshield. I saw them very far off in the distance at first. The fact that I could see them at all from that far away should have alerted me immediately to their immense size, but it didn't. I guess I just thought they were closer than they actually were, if I even thought about it at all. One guy was chasing another guy, and the two of them were running toward the highway. I thought they might have been racing, but when one of them caught up with the other, they seemed to be having some kind of possibly violent battle going on. I wondered if one of them was trying to end the life of the other one, but at that distance, I still couldn't rule out that it might have been two football or basketball players having fun and roughhousing with one another, the way young guys with too much energy can sometimes do. As the battling and racing figures drew closer to Route 66, they became increasingly more interesting to me. There was something alarming about them, but I couldn't yet put my finger on exactly what. They seemed too large. That was one issue I had. And they seemed to have animal heads, even though they ran on two legs like a man. They were wearing furs, it looked like, unless that was their fur, and they were not, in fact, human at all. I felt like I was driving into a Fellini film. It was a very Donnie Darko moment decades before Donnie Darko. I really thought reality was melting around me for a minute there. The creatures looked like they were going to intersect with Route 66 somewhere off in front of me. I'm not sure exactly how far, but I felt like I was a safe distance away as I slowed the car down and observed them. There was one that had a Sasquatch body and head, but with the most human features on its dark gray-colored face. It sure seemed tall, but was dwarfed by the giant brownish, grayish wolf that ran on its hind legs. The Bigfoot seemed between 12 and 17 feet tall, but that was impossible, because that would have made the dog-headed one at least 20 feet tall, and those are probably conservative estimates. The Bigfoot seemed to be trying to get away from the Dogman, and in this wide-open space, the only way he could do that would be to outrun him. His goal in that moment seemed to be to run across Route 66 where I was, then across Interstate 40, all 4 lanes and grass partition included. You see, over in that spot, Route 66 runs 2 lanes to the right of the 2 westward leading lanes of Interstate 40. Then, further to the left, is a grassy separating area, and then 2 lanes of I-40 heading back east into Oklahoma. Once the creatures had passed over my 2 lanes, they would need to get past 4 more. I was only seeing 1 car or truck every 5 or 10 minutes that night, so it didn't seem as though there was going to be too much to stop them from going wherever they wanted to go. As the giant Squatch set foot on the edge of the highway, the Dogman tackled him from behind. Rolling into my lane from my right were the 2 largest wrestlers in world history. It really reminded me of the Bruno Sammartino fights my parents used to watch on black and white TV. They rolled over each other onto the highway, blocking parts of both lanes. I did what was the custom back in the day when crazy stuff happened on the highway. I pulled off onto the grass, made sure all my doors were locked, and I sat there and watched the show. I even broke out my portable binoculars for this one, as I was not willing to drive up any closer to the fighting than I already was. This wasn't just a terrifying thing to see, but this was also a surreal and disorienting vision to witness as well. I remember wondering if I had somehow ingested a hallucinogen, but I didn't feel any of the side effects of something like that. With each ensuing second, my panic intensified. Soon, my heart was beating very fast, and I felt hot and flushed just out of fear. I could no longer tell if I was sober or if my internal chemistry was somehow being messed with. My gut instincts all still tell me that what I saw that day was real, though. As crazy as it sounds, I think I really was witnessing 2 incredibly large animals battling with each other. Most likely to the death. The huge dog had every advantage over the Bigfoot. The sounds emitted by the caveman-like creature were pathetic, as the much larger Dogman had his way with the Squatch each time he was able to catch up with it. I wondered what had started this fight, because to the Dogman, this seemed like some sort of a grudge match. He was so angry, so furious, that his movement seemed almost twice as quick as the Sasquatch's. Both of them appeared to be in the prime of health. Neither of them seemed to be either young or old. Even as I squinted at the battle off in the distance, I wondered how either of those things could ever have come into existence, let alone both of them. There was one point where the Bigfoot grabbed the Dogman by one of his ears with his left hand and pummeled him with open-hand strikes with his right. The Dogman shrieked and yiped at that, but was quickly able to extricate himself from the hold and return to punishing the 15-foot-tall Bigfoot. For the most part, the fighting appeared to be pretty one-sided, and the Dogman seemed to have an almost cruel advantage. I watched them fight in front of me for what felt like 5 minutes or more. In all that time, there had been no traffic, but I remember that eventually a guy in a station wagon pulled off Route 66 and parked on the grass behind me. He got out of his vehicle armed with only one of those tiny early 70s pocket Instamatic cameras. They were smaller than a modern cell phone and about an inch thick. I couldn't believe how brave this guy was getting out of his car when the two giants were fighting only about 300 feet down the road. He inspired me, and I got out too, walking over and introducing myself. He grunted in acknowledgement but didn't give me his name. I asked him if there would be any way I could see those photos when they were developed. He grunted non-committally and kept taking snapshots. After some time, I gave the guy my address on a little piece of paper and told him I'd be glad to pay money to see the pics when they came out. He promised to write me, but he never did. Looking back on it, I bet the photos didn't show very much at all. You probably only ended up seeing a dark, tiny blur way off in the distance. Even so, I'm still curious to this day what showed up in those photos. If you're the young man who was there with the tiny little camera on that night, or if you know who that was, please contact me through this channel and put us in touch again. Or, if you have access to those photos, I might still be willing to put up a few bucks to see them, if there's anything in them to see. At any rate, we heard a police siren coming from behind us, and the guy ran to his car. He got it started, drove across the grass to I-40, and drove on past the two battling behemoths. I figured he must have had some reason to fear the law, but I didn't, so I waited there outside my car, going over in my mind what I had seen so far, in order to relate it to the officer. I was sure he'd be curious how this situation had come about. The police car pulled over and stopped, turning the siren off as well. I waved to the officer as he emerged from his vehicle. Then I returned to watching the giant monsters fighting each other. The policeman didn't seem interested in the Dogman or the Bigfoot in the slightest, but he sure was giving me a strange look, as though unsure what to say. He asked me if I needed any help. I thought about it. No, I didn't need any help. Well, does your vehicle need any help, sir? Came the next question. My vehicle? No, officer, my vehicle's just fine. It can't drive anywhere, though. The officer face-palmed and looked really unhappy. Then he asked me why my car couldn't drive anywhere, if it was fine. Now it was my turn to give the policeman a funny look. The car can't drive anywhere, I pointed out to the policeman, because the road was blocked. Blocked? Asked the highway patrolman. Blocked by what? I made a motion toward the Dogman and the Sasquatch, but as I did so, I failed to see them there any longer. I dropped my hand, I looked around, I looked to the left, I looked to the right. As I pointed out, I could see for miles from that location. There was no place that the two of them could have run off to. There was no building for them to have ducked inside, and no tree for them to be hiding behind. And yet, when I looked left and I looked right, there was nothing there. but Shamrock, Texas. I don't remember what I said, but I remember I asked the officer if I was free to go, in some fashion. He asked me if he needed to give me a breathalyzer test, and I assured him he did not. After some negotiation, I got him to agree to let me leave, but I never got him to stop looking at me, as though I were a Looney Tune. I drove off, directly through where I had seen the monsters fighting, and man, did that ever raise the goosebumps on my arms. I didn't see or hear them as I passed through, so I don't think that they became invisible. They just weren't there any longer. Now you understand my intense curiosity about what may or may not have come out in those instamatic snapshots that the unfriendly stranger took. At least I know I'm not crazy, because that other guy saw the giant cryptids as well. Well, unless I imagined him too, I suppose that could have happened. I mean, he did split before the cop arrived, so I was the only one who saw him. I should have looked before I left to see if his tire tracks across the grass toward I-40 were still there. You know, I should have done a lot of things. Shoulda, coulda, woulda. My own opinion, for what little it counts, is that the creatures were there in one sense or another, but I can't really decide in what sense I mean that. Was I looking into their reality or their dimension? Were they intruding upon ours? Did they disappear because of the police officer's arrival? Or did the fact that the officer didn't see them cause their reality to shrink, weaken, and disintegrate? Do monsters depend on our belief in them to manifest? Do they only manifest to the imaginative as a result of this? Or do we imaginative people just have overactive imaginations? I get asked all the time which one won the fight, and I can't honestly say because the battle was still raging the last time I saw it with my eyes. Having said that, however, the fighting was never really going well for the Sasquatch. The Dogman was the one doing the pursuing. The Dogman had the height advantage over the Bigfoot. The Dogman attacked with both claws and teeth, and he was merciless, harming the poor Squatch from every angle at will. The very human-looking face of the Bigfoot made it clear through its expressions that he was in great distress throughout the ordeal. The same could not be said of the Dogman, whose overall demeanor was one of anger, fury, and hatred toward the Bigfoot. I would have to say that the Bigfoot I saw was so immense and so savage that it would need to be considered more deadly than any animal currently known to modern science. But that Bigfoot was no match for the 7-yard Dogman. He was 21 feet of sheer terror. If that larger breed of Dogman took over in this reality, I'd say humanity's days would be numbered. I don't know what it would require to take that size of a Dogman down. So the answer is that the Dogman was winning, and the Bigfoot appeared to me to have no chance. Maybe in a thick forest he could have gotten away, but there ain't no forest over there in Shamrock, Texas. I would say that the judges would come to a unanimous decision in this case. The 7-yard Dogman would most definitely be the winner of the fight between 15-foot Bigfoot versus 7-yard Dogman. Bigfoot versus Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got an old tale for you from my youth that happened to me in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. Assuming you haven't heard of this place, it's located about 60 miles southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which would be the closest major city. It's almost as far west and south as you can go in Pennsylvania, located 200 miles northwest of Washington, D.C., 250 miles due east of Columbus, Ohio, and 200 miles northeast of Point Pleasant, West Virginia, home of the Mothman, as reported in John A. Keel's classic book, The Mothman Prophecies. Mill Run is a beautiful place in the country, but it's actually somewhat famous internationally, at least to lovers of great architecture. This is because Mill Run is the home of Falling Water, a building which intertwines with a waterfall in a very unique way. Designed by legendary architect Frank Lloyd Wright, Falling Water is considered such an important human achievement that it's included in the UNESCO World Heritage List. In fact, it's the first modern architecture in the United States to be included on that list. Falling Water was the main reason I was in that area of Pennsylvania on that hot summer night in 1972. I had dropped out of college and began a cross-country trek to, quote, find myself, unquote. A lot of people were doing that kind of thing back then, just wandering off into the wilderness, looking for some sign or some true meaning of life before they settled down into their boring, meaningless 9-to-5 adulthood. Although the world I inherited was vastly different from the world my parents had come from, my generation was still more traditional than now, and once I was done being a hippie, I found myself getting married, having 2 kids, and working endlessly for decades to put those kids through school and college. Although my generation prolonged our adolescence, we did eventually grow up. But this story happened when I was still young and completely open to new ideas. Nothing I encountered really surprised me, and at the same moment, everything I encountered was a huge surprise. Being out in nature entirely alone when you had grown up in a city, you begin to understand how people could come to believe in ghosts and monsters and the true deep power of myth. And it was very near to Falling Water, where I was secretly camping out in these woods that very well may have been privately owned, that I encountered 2 of the greatest myths of all in real life engaged in mortal combat with each other. One of them I had heard of before, although I thought he only lived out in the Pacific Northwest. The other I had never heard of before and would only come to identify 2 decades later. I'm going to tell you the story of the time I saw a very large Sasquatch fighting a turf war with what had to have been the Pennsylvania Dogman. This is how it all started. I was falling asleep in my tent, which was set up in the vicinity of Falling Water, but don't ask me exactly where. This was a long time ago, and I didn't really care where I was even back then. As I said, I was seeking to find myself and all that. Suddenly, I sat straight up in my tent when I heard a scream that they invented the term blood-curdling to describe. I honestly thought that I was hearing someone in extreme pain somewhere. I was too much of a hippie to think I was hearing someone being attacked. I jumped to the conclusion that it was someone who had fallen or injured themselves in some accident. I felt a deep sense of duty to run out into the darkness and help that poor individual. But I sat there frozen for a while, feeling the adrenaline surging through me and also feeling a growing sense of panic. I never again after that night heard this kind of a scream, until very recently actually, when I saw a meme on the internet. I forget what site I saw it on, maybe YouTube. Tell me if you've seen this one. There were 2 cops heading into a graveyard, then they hear a scream like the one I heard that night, and they immediately turned and ran right back out of that cemetery. This was a scream that could terrify experienced police officers, so imagine how I felt alone in the darkness in a clearing in the woods, hearing that same kind of a scream. As much as my conscious mind was telling me that I was hearing a person in distress who needed me to rescue them, my subconscious must have been feeling that same threat that the cops felt that night. So I pulled my boots on and I pulled myself together. Then I braced myself to head out into the dark night, armed only with my flashlight and my minimalist first aid kit. I unzipped the tent. I climbed outside, and a second blood-curdling scream, this time even louder and definitely coming from the direction of Falling Water, erupted. My knees literally powered down, and I found myself climbing back into my tent, shivering so badly that I nearly felt like I was getting frostbite on an 85-degree night. Inside the tent again, I ran excuses through my head about why I shouldn't investigate further. Whoever that was screaming, they were over by the Frank Lloyd Wright building. Surely someone over there would hear them, and come to rescue them. Surely they had access to better first aid equipment than I had in my tent. I made up excuse after excuse until that same scream erupted again, this time sounding more high-pitched and quite possibly a woman. I don't know if it's still politically correct to feel a sense of responsibility toward the safety of women. Maybe it's more feminist to leave them alone to perish. All I knew is that if I let a woman alone in the darkness who sounded like she was in such a pain, I would have felt guilty, as if I had attacked her myself. I couldn't stop my eyes from tearing up, and I couldn't stop my hands from shaking violently in fear. But I sucked it up, and I went out into that darkness once again, knowing that it would be wrong not to. I knew which way I needed to head, even if I had no idea what I was going to find. I braced myself that there would be more ungodly screams to make me want to jump out of my skin. I told myself that I would not be afraid when the next scream hit. After all, if the screaming got louder, that was a good thing. It meant I was getting closer to where I needed to be in order to rescue that poor woman, whoever she was. I was maybe about 15 or 20 trees deep into the woods when the scream erupted again, even louder than last time. Again, my knees buckled, and I slipped down, grabbing onto a nearby tree to keep from falling on my face. I was very disappointed in myself. I had known I would hear it again. I had psyched myself up to be ready for it, and yet, once that scream came, I had been even more frightened than before. I cursed myself for being so illogical. After all, it was a human being in distress. It's not like I was hearing the cries of a monster, after all. I searched around for some time, shining my pathetic early 70s battery-operated flashlight around. I felt I had to call out to the woman, tell her I was looking for her, and hope she called back to give me her location. I knew that was the thing I had to do, but I can't even describe how scared I was to actually do that. I really did not want to give out my location. I was so frightened, but I told myself I was being absurd and silly. I was behaving like a coward, is what I said to myself inside my head. Little did I know that the intense body fear I was experiencing was far wiser than my conscious mind could have been. My inner child, my inner voice, my unconscious, my nervous system, and my body all knew I was in great danger. But my conscious mind had been selected and placed in the President's Oval Office of my brain, and my conscious mind was a complete idiot. And so I walked ever closer toward the exact place I should have been keeping away from. I remember taking a deep breath to call out to the woman out there in the darkness, to ask her where she was and how I could help. The air rested in my lungs, waiting for me to use it for a shout, but instead, I breathed it out quietly, and I began weeping. So upset was I about shouting out into that particular wooded area. I remember clenching my fists and my teeth and inhaling again, this time letting out a weak, "Hello?" I cleared my throat and tried again, louder and with a slightly less shaky voice. "Hello? Is there someone out there?" I heard a sound that I at first took to be a kettle drum or a bass drum coming from behind me. The ground began to tremble under my feet as the heavy, thudding sound grew closer and closer. Whatever that was, it was not a lady in distress. It sounded more like something as heavy as a moose, except it didn't sound like it was galloping. It sounded as though something as heavy as an adult horse were running on its hind legs. Honestly, that was an even scarier thing to hear than the screaming was. I know I was petrified, like I was experiencing a ghost or a devil, something supernatural. It just didn't make sense to me, and my nervous system staged a coup, ousting my conscious mind from the Oval Office and putting my body in charge instead. I found myself running forward, tearing through underbrush, with the underbrush tearing through me as well. Whatever was coming up behind me, it had to be something that wasn't supposed to exist. I had made a huge mistake, and I felt that my life story was about to come to an abrupt end. Tripping over a big tree root that I hadn't seen, I fell face forward onto the grass in a clearing. Everything hurt, especially my face. I pulled myself up enough to begin to crawl forward when the sound of an angry and large dog barking and growling at me made me stop right where I was. Painfully lifting my head to see the dog in front of me, I instead saw only the hind legs of the dog, which was even larger than I had been visualizing. Nothing was making sense. I was in search of an injured lady, but instead I was being chased from behind by an unseen giant. And in front of me was... well, what was in front of me? It took great effort to pull myself up into a position where I was kneeling and looking forward. Sure enough, it was an immense gray dog in front of me, but it was standing up on its hind legs like a man would. I don't even mean like a gorilla or a chimp, since they actually stand hunched over and usually use their front arms to help them walk. This dog in front of me stood fully erect with posture that would have made my first grade teacher proud. When my eyes got far enough up to make eye contact with the beast, I was stunned to see it reflecting back eye shine so brightly that it hurt to look into those eyes. I was not shining my flashlight directly at it, and there was not enough ambient lighting to provide that much eye shine. It almost looked as though the dog's eyes were lit up from inside, but I know things don't work that way. It also had a far wider chest than any dog I've ever seen. Perhaps it was a wolf or some other precursor of our modern pet dogs. It did have ears and a snout very similar to those of wolves, but it had a set of choppers like something out of a horror movie. It looked like it could take down an even larger creature with those teeth alone. I didn't know back then what I was even dealing with. I didn't think that it might be a werewolf because it didn't look like Lon Chaney. I had no awareness of Dogman back then. Very few people did, really. I mean, we're talking about the early 1970s, and this was not Michigan or Wisconsin. All I knew was that once I looked into those glowing white eyes, the big, upright canine became quite offended and barked even louder. It took a few surprisingly steady bipedal steps in my direction, barking louder, snarling, and pulling its lips back to show off its meat-eating teeth. I pointed my head down to the ground, instinctively adopting a submissive pose. I don't think I even knew what that word meant back then, but as I said, my body had deposed my mind and taken over, and my body knew its only chance for survival was to essentially beg that 8-foot-tall carnivore to allow me to live. I bowed my head. I stared at the grass, but I began to accept the worst. My mission of mercy might be about to end with extreme pain, and then... what? I wondered what happens to us after our lives, and I realized I might be about to find out. And then, from behind me, that woman screamed again, causing me and the giant dog to react in surprise. I turned quickly, not having the vaguest idea what I would see. When my eyes focused, I can assure you I was not looking at a woman, in distress or otherwise. I was looking at the greatest mythological creature of my era. I was absolutely certain I was craning my neck upward to see a Bigfoot. This creature did not look like Patty. It was not 6 feet tall, and it didn't have a hairy bra strapped to its chest. It did have a conical-shaped head, but other than that, I was seeing something completely impossible. This could not have been a man in a costume. This was something far more like an ape man. too tall, and with eyes that were not human, but animal. The way it moved was not the way a man moves. Even Rick Baker could not move the way this thing did. It was just nothing like us, while simultaneously seeming just like a person. It is very hard to describe because there is nothing else like what I was looking at. It doesn't compare well to anything in the known record of animals. The Sasquatch man put on a fearsome display of its ferocity, beating on its chest like a gorilla and opening its mouth wide, displaying all of its teeth and gums as well. And then it screamed like an injured woman, and I realized how stupid I had been. I mean, my conscious mind finally connected on what a complete moron I had been acting like. If I had stayed shivering in my tent, I likely never would have been confronted with either of these creatures. They probably would have been curious about my tent and camp, but they also probably would not have come too close to it. I had foolishly walked right into the dark woods alone, and now this Bigfoot was going to, charge past me? That's what it did. It thundered right past me like King Kong Jr., and it got right in the face of that big, upright dog. The two of them were about as evenly matched as a heavyweight title bout, both of them standing roughly the same height, around 8 feet, and both of them seeming to have around the same reach, with their very long front arms. Or really, I can just say arms, I suppose, since neither of them was quadrupedal. They both seemed very bipedal. I've read people since then describing Dogman and Bigfoot both as being creatures that can drop to all fours and run more quickly than they can on 2 legs, but I saw none of that on this night. Possibly because they were each trying to frighten off the other. They both stood up as tall as they could and never dropped down to all fours. When the Bigfoot screamed in the Dogman's face, it backed up a few steps, but began barking and whimpering at the ape-man's face in return. Whereas the Bigfoot's posture was confident and threatening, the Dogman appeared more worried. His high-pitched yammering seemed very agitated and threatening as well, but it seemed that he didn't really want to fight something as large as the Sasquatch. Bigfoot was acting like, "Back off or I'll smash you," while Dogman was more like, "If you fight me, we're both gonna get completely messed up. Are you sure you want to do that?" The Bigfoot said yes and screamed louder at the Dogman, who did not back up even 1 step this time. The Bigfoot's shouting was becoming more like a screeching. It sounded less and less like a woman, and more like a baby crying, as bizarre as that might seem. I gathered that both creatures were in an increasingly more agitated state, but my body was still too frozen in fear for me to do anything but watch with my very dulled down and shocked eyes. The Dogman was the first to attempt to actually fight, as it snapped at the throat of the Bigfoot and barely missed. This caused the Sasquatch to react with flailing arms, swinging wildly as its eyes opened to max width, and its screeching grew so loud that my ears were beginning to hurt very badly. The Bigfoot, whose teeth were not human-like at all, but rather as feral and carnivorous as the Dogman, began snapping at the canine creature in a similar way to how it had been snapping at him. Soon, the Bigfoot leaped upon the Dogman, and the two rolled several times over. They spun into a medium-sized tree, cracking the trunk loudly and sending leaves flying in all directions. I was weeping, wishing I could be back in my tent, and then it dawned on me. I actually could be back in my tent. The monster men were preoccupied with each other, and there was nothing preventing me from running back to my camp. I stood up, and blood rushed to my head, dizzying me. I tilted sideways, using a tree for support and hurting my wrist in the process. The sounds of growling and furious babies screaming was so unnerving that again my body took over and navigated me back to my tent in the clearing. It took me a few tries to zip the tent up once I was back inside because my hands were both shaking so much. I cried like the same baby that Bigfoot's screams sounded like, and I listened as the terrible battle continued in the woods out of my sight. I wondered who would win this turf fight, and I prayed that they would have forgotten about me before their fighting was done. Well, I really don't know what happened after I left, but I do know that eventually the battling quieted, and then I heard the longest, loudest howling I've ever heard in my life. That had to have been the Dogman, and its howl was answered by canines in all directions around me. I don't know if it defeated the Bigfoot, or if the Bigfoot ran away to fight another day. I just know that the Dogman kept howling for what felt like an hour. It was probably more like 5 minutes, but to me it sounded like it was never going to stop. That next morning, I was so shaken up that I actually went and found myself a hotel room to sleep in. I slept all day, and after getting some dinner, I spent the night there too. I seriously considered calling off my ramblings and heading back home, but after getting my strength back, I found I still wanted to go back out there and rough it some more. I found myself camping closer to human habitation or official campsites, and each night before bed, I made a contingency plan for what to do in case of emergency. I actually only gave up when the weather got cold again, hopping on a bus and heading back to my parents' place. Out of all my time in the wilderness, my only time encountering anything weird at all was on that one scary night. In fact, my entire life has been pretty average and mostly boring ever since the time I saw the battle of Bigfoot versus Dogman. James Tucker ain't a chicken plucker or an all-day sucker or a flatbed trucker, because we think it's quite a shame that you don't all appreciate James. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer, James Tucker, for making this episode possible. In exchange, James gets to watch our secret, uncensored Dogman stories far too wild to ever tell on this channel, and you can see them too. All you gotta do is join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or else do what James Tucker, who isn't a flatbed trucker, did and click on that join link under this or any of our videos to become a Scary Stories channel member. And now, here's international TV spokes doggy Henry Lee Dogman to fill in the rest of the deets. Hank? Thanks, Biggie. And thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com, or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that one. It cuts off after, I think, 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.